This is the golden rule of happiness. Write it down, memorize it. It's the foundation upon which everything else in this series rests. Here it is. Pursue righteousness and you'll get happiness thrown in. Pursue happiness directly and you'll get neither righteousness or happiness. If you remember just one thing about this series, make it this. Everything else that follows is summed up in this one idea. You don't get happiness by pursuing it directly. You have to pursue righteousness first and you'll get happiness coming in through the side door. Let me explain. The first recorded philosophical discussions about happiness and where to find it date back to the ancient Greeks, around 6,000 years ago. The thinkers of that era surmised that the key to happiness was the direct pursuit of pleasure. Indeed, the equation for the ancient Greeks seemed very simple. Pleasure is what brings the greatest sensations of happiness. Therefore, we must pursue pleasure to be happy. That was the sum of it. It's become known as the hedonic theory. Aristippus was a Greek philosopher who in 4 BC summarized that happiness was merely the sum of life's hedonic moments. Now, human beings have always found it very difficult to move beyond the simplicity of the hedonic theory because instinctively it seems to make a lot of sense. We are indeed happiest, or at least most aware of our happiness, when we are doing something obviously pleasurable. Therefore, it does seem to track that if we want more happiness, we should simply pursue more pleasure. Indeed, the thinking goes something like this. Eating delicious food is obviously pleasurable. Therefore, we should eat as much delicious food as possible to be as happy as possible. Alcohol is pleasurable. Therefore, we should drink as much alcohol as possible to be as happy as possible. Sex is pleasurable. Therefore, we should have as much sex as possible to be as happy as possible. And the same goes for partying, entertainment, nice cars, nice houses, lots of possessions, perhaps even things like drugs, and certainly money. Because money, of course, though it doesn't provide intrinsic pleasure, there's no intrinsic pleasure to bits of paper, it makes the pursuit of all those other pleasures much easier. It can buy the food and the alcohol and the entertainment and the cars and all those things I just mentioned and much more besides. So we're talking about hedonism here. Indeed, Aristippus is regarded as the father of hedonism. Hedonism is simply defined in the dictionary as the pursuit of pleasure, sensual self-indulgence. But philosophically, it's defined as the ethical theory that pleasure is the highest good and the proper aim of human life. Now, whether consciously acknowledged or not, the vast majority of people from ancient Greece until this very moment have subscribed and do subscribe to the hedonic theory. We do indeed believe that happiness is the highest good and the most important thing in life. And we do indeed believe that to be happy, we have to therefore pursue pleasure. As a teenage meme writer might put it today, life's too short, so do what makes you happy. Our ideas on the issue haven't really changed very much in the 6,000 years since Aristippus. We still think that pleasures like wealth and possessions and cars and houses and food and alcohol is the path to happiness. Indeed, a few years ago for a different Fuel Project series, I did some street interviews in the Massachusetts area, around Boston and Worcester. And I wanted to find out what people's idea of a dream life was. If they could design their perfect life to be the happiest that they could possibly be, then what would that look like? And so many responders instantly turned to a life of pleasure and ease and money and houses and cars.
What would it be?
Probably to win the lottery, own some big property, start a business.
It would be a big house with a lot of green and a swimming pool, and it would be in a nice neighborhood, and it would be peaceful, and the sun would be very bright.
My dream life is to get out of Worcester, maybe go up to Maine, go live in a nice lake house up there, and just relax and just take it easy for the rest of my life and no worries. That's it.
Cash. Few houses and a few girls. I'm not even gonna lie. And I like to buy my mama a house and my family. And I just would like a lot of money because money will change your life.
My dream life would be if someone paid me to travel around the world.
So my dream life, a big house, every car I want, a nice family, a good job, and all the friends and family in the world. That's perfect.
How much money?
How much money?
Yeah.
All the money I can get, all the money in the world, all of it.
It's a hard question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would, some type of star, you know, a movie actor, something like that.
How Hollywood?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just want $1 billion. After that, I'll take care of the rest.
My dream life, probably live in maybe a 4,000 square foot log cabin out in the wilderness somewhere, maybe in Montana or something like that. Fish, hunt every day. No work.
No work.
Yeah, hang out with my children, and that's that's about it.
I think it would be a lot of nothing. I think it would be a lot of sitting around, easy, carefree.
My dream life, literally like a big apartment, seeing over the city, a nice car, quiet life, pretty much.
Quiet life, that's all, nothing else?
Relaxing.
So you can see from those answers that people do instinctively believe in the hedonic theory. When asked about the happiest life they can possibly imagine, they instinctively turned to pleasure, to money, to houses, girls, fame, easy living, and all the rest of it. But of course, if the hedonic theory is actually true, then we should expect to see some clear evidence. Namely, the people who've already achieved those things should be the happiest people on earth. Those who have access to the most pleasure, those who live the most hedonistic lives, they should be the happiest people on earth, right? They should literally be living the dream. And yet, when we examine the evidence, we discover that's not really the case. The hedonic theory doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The richest, the most hedonistic people on the planet are emphatically not the happiest. Indeed, often they seem to be the most troubled. The famous Hollywood actor Jim Carrey once famously said, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." Now, the problem for most of us is this. The problem is that most of us are not going to get rich and famous and do everything that we ever dreamed of. So we'll never know for sure that it isn't the answer. So instinctive is the hedonic theory inside us that there's always going to be that little voice that thinks maybe pleasure could be the answer. And then if it hasn't worked out for other people like Jim Carrey, then he's just not been doing it right. Sure, Jim, lots of money and pleasure may not have been the answer for you, but it would be for me. If I was in your shoes, I couldn't fail to be happy. It's kind of how we think. In fact, so instinctive and so ingrained is the hedonic theory inside us that we tend to dismiss people who speak against it, as though they're lying or they just haven't been doing it right. It's like a village, you hear a rumor of mountain treasure buried in a cave. The whole village sets off in a race to find it. Now, one man gets there first and he gets into the cave and he explores and he digs. He finds nothing in there. There's no treasure in that cave. And as he returns back down the mountain, he passes hundreds of other villagers who are still striving to get up there. And he tells them, "Look guys, do not waste your time. I've just been in that cave. There's no treasure at all." And yet they all look at him suspiciously and go, "I don't know if I believe you, Jim. Maybe there was no treasure for you in that cave, but I know that if I explored it, there would be treasure for me." And so, ignoring the advice from the one who's actually been there, the hapless villagers press on with their wild goose chase. I think maybe a better way of thinking about it is that it's like a rainbow chase. So in ancient European mythology, and everybody knows this, there is meant to be a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. But of course the trick is that rainbows actually don't have an end. The place where you think the rainbow's hitting the ground is just an optical illusion. And if you go over to where you think the rainbow ends and then look up, it's now going to look like it's several miles away. And if you wander over there and look up, it's now going to look like it's moved again, and so on and so on. And that's what life is like for those who are chasing happiness through hedonism. It's like chasing rainbows. You think you see the pleasure on the horizon that's going to bring you the happiness. Maybe it's more money, and maybe one day you achieve the money, but it still doesn't make you happy. And then you look up and think, "Oh, I've just been digging in the wrong place. It wasn't about money, it's that new car." And the new car becomes the rainbow. And so you go over there, maybe one day you achieve that new car, but it still doesn't make you happy. And so you look up and think, "Oh, I've just been digging in the wrong place. It's about that bigger house." The bigger house becomes the new rainbow. If I could just get that bigger house, then I'd be happy. And on it goes. Some people can spend their whole lives chasing rainbows like this. We bounce from one fixation to the next, always hoping that the next pleasure is going to be the one that brings the everlasting fulfillment. It's going to be the one that ends the anxiety and the stress and the depression, and it never does. It's a wild goose chase that we can spend our whole lives engaged in. The happiness that we think is going to be found in some distant, unattained pleasure doesn't actually exist. Celebrities are simply those who have dug every hole there is to dig. They've dug under the money rainbow, they've dug under the alcohol rainbow, they've dug under the supercar rainbow, and they're still not fulfilled. And they're able to report back to the rest of us, "Look, no pleasure is going to solve the problem long term. And that's effectively what Jim Carrey's saying. He's saying, look everyone, I've had access to every pleasure there is. I've had access to everything that you think is going to make you happy. I've had all the money, the fame, the sex, the parties, the booze, the drugs that it's possible to have, and I'm still anxious and I'm still depressed. Lasting happiness isn't found in any one of those things. It's just a wild goose chase. Indeed, if you look at many of the biggest superstars in the world, past and present, a lot of them have openly admitted to being plagued by anxiety and depression in spite of all their possessions and all their pleasures. I won't read all of them out, but all of these people have admitted to suffering anxiety and depression in spite of everything that they have. Indeed, some of them are renowned for even committing suicide. Now, these are people who attained everything that they could ever want. They achieved access to every pleasure their hearts could possibly desire, and yet it still hasn't made them truly happy. Sometimes it even made their anxiety and depression worse. Sometimes it brought them to the edge of hopelessness and despair, which actually makes perfect sense. When you pin your hopes for happiness in pleasures, and then you exhaust every pleasure there is and still don't find the happiness, there's nothing left to hope for after that. There are no more rainbows left to dig beneath. Coming to the end of all known pleasures and discovering you're still not happy when pleasures were exactly where you thought happiness lay is a bleak thing. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that all pleasure is wrong or evil or anything like that. I'm not saying that at all. A bit of pleasure rightly experienced is a great thing. But I am saying that Aristippus was wrong. I am saying that the hedonic theory is wrong. I am saying that contrary to our instinct, lasting joy does not come through the pursuit of pleasure. Anxiety psychologist Dr. Christina Barber-Addis says, I see a lot of young people with anxiety around wanting more. There's a belief that happiness is just around the corner if they make enough money and are able to buy the nice car and wear the nice clothes. But of course, happiness does not come with the purchase of these things. They are always left wanting more. This is the cruel trick of the hedonic theory. It keeps us chasing rainbows all our lives. It keeps us always wanting more. It keeps us unsatisfied and striving for things that simply don't deliver. And just to finish off this episode, I have to say that it's not just the anecdotal evidence that tells us that happiness isn't found in the pursuit of pleasure. Science confirms it too. I've spoken about this process in previous series, but it's worth repeating again here in this context. What we experience as pleasure is actually the release of a chemical compound in our brains called dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, meaning that it carries signals across the spaces between brain cells. Now, our brains pick up the presence of this feel-good dopamine chemical through something called receptors. Receptors act like docking stations that the dopamine binds to whenever it's released in the brain. So essentially then the process is this. We do something pleasurable, dopamine is then released in our brains, the receptors pick up its presence, and that sends out a feel-good signal. Now, there are certain experiences that are so pleasurable, they cause our dopamine to spike to extraordinary levels. Scientists call activities and substances that flood our brain with dopamine super stimuli. Sex is one example. An orgasm releases a wave of dopamine that feels positively euphoric. Drugs are another obvious example. Drugs like cocaine and heroin raise our dopamine levels to about 300%. They provide an incredibly intense feeling of pleasure. But there's a problem though. The brain doesn't like being overstimulated by dopamine. It wants to maintain a state of equilibrium or stasis. Therefore, if it experiences an overwhelming surge of the chemical, it will start shutting down dopamine receptors so that it becomes less sensitive to its presence. Now, when the brain shuts down dopamine receptors like this, it numbs our ability to feel its presence, and hence we don't feel pleasure as easily. We have a numbed pleasure response. So you can see the problem here then. When we indulge in hedonism and start flooding our brains with dopamine, it's undeniably true that at the beginning we will experience a surge, a feeling of euphoria. However, the longer we indulge in hedonistic activities, the more the brain will begin to turn off receptors in response to the overstimulation. Consequently, the more numbed we will become to the feelings of pleasure. Essentially then, hedonism works on a law of diminishing returns. The more you indulge in pleasures, the less pleasure you will actually feel. Hedonism is kind of self-defeating. This is why people who take drugs over time need harder and harder varieties to get the same effect. It's why people who love sugar over time need sweeter and sweeter treats to get the same levels of satisfaction. It's why porn addicts over time need harder and harder material to get the same level of arousal. The brain becomes numbed to pleasure through overstimulation, so we need bigger and more extreme hits to achieve the same effect. Hedonism then, far from being a path to lasting joy, will actually numb you to pleasure in the long run. It will leave us feeling even more anxious and unfulfilled and depressed in the end. The ancient Greeks and most people ever since have had it wrong. We don't find happiness by pursuing it directly. The hedonic theory is just too simplistic and will actually lead to depression and despair if we pursue it long enough. Indeed, we'll experience something called anhedonia if we head down that path. Anhedonia means the inability to feel pleasure in normally pleasurable activities. No, if we want to be truly joyful, both the science and the anecdotal evidence leads us in another direction entirely. It tells us, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that if we want to be happy, we have to pursue righteousness.